Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Jim Walters. I'm Director of the LSE Faith Centre. I'm really delighted to welcome you all, particularly visitors, to the London School of Economics this afternoon. It was 10 years ago tomorrow, actually, that we formally opened the LSE Faith Centre with a dialogue between Bishop Rowan Williams and the late French philosopher Bruno Latour. It wasn't perhaps the opening event that some people expected, and as it was part of the opening of the student centre as a whole, we were surrounded at various points in the day by circus performers and drag queens, somewhat contrasting with our rather more formal religious dignitaries. I suppose I wanted to host this dialogue in order to say two things about the LSE Faith Centre. The first was that I did not want this new centre to be the box in which the LSE put religion in order to close the lid. There were religion-related projects going on at LSE 10 years ago, particularly in the anthropology department, who I'm pleased to see out in force this afternoon. But the fact that our second session this afternoon will include a number of LSE postdocs from different faiths working on religion-related topics is, I think, a sign that we've made a lot more progress in overcoming the secular biases of the social sciences, which, in my view, remain such a handicap to understanding today's world. This progress has in part been enabled by the Religion and Global Society Research Unit that's now attached to that centre. You'll hear, I'm sure, a bit more about the work of the unit from my colleague Dr. Hanan Bernardi in the next session, but its intellectual significance lies principally in a willingness to move beyond religious studies as some neutral observation of what religious people do through a secular lens. Rather, we're trying to get immersed in theological perspectives as their own sources of wisdom and interpretation. And that was really what Bruno Latour urged us to do 10 years ago. He was quite unabashed in his criticisms of this institution and the dominant ideologies he believed we have propagated. Economics, he said, is a theory of ownership that was actually made here at the LSE and has made the fortune of the LSE. People come from all over the world to know what it is to own a thing, and that's called economic theory, with great indifference to the externalities, to use an economic term. But this place, he said, the new Faith Centre inside the LSE, might produce the antidote to the poison which is taught in other parts of the LSE. And that's where we've drawn our title for the symposium today. For Latour, ancient religious notions of the commons, exchanges that are symbolic and not just transactional, and more enchanted notions of materiality were all crucial resources in building a world that doesn't simply extract, commodify, and trade until there is nothing left to sacrifice to the god of the market. So the LSE Faith Centre is not a place where you switch your brain off. It's where people are challenged by encounter with difference, and where we're challenged by encountering what is different and difficult within our own faith traditions, including where they rub up against or reframe what we're exploring in the classroom or lecture hall. Many people have helped us to develop the Faith Centre as something taken seriously within the university. Craig Calhoun, who chaired that original dialogue, then Manoush Shafiq and now Larry Kramer have all recognised the importance and potential of the work we do. David and Kitty Beacon have been foremost among a number of donors who have supported our extracurricular programmes, and the Templeton Religion Trust have been crucial to getting our research unit off the ground. The second motivation behind that event 10 years ago was a conviction that ecological sustainability is not just another good cause. Religious people are meant to love a good cause, and secular people think that a good cause will keep religious people out of trouble. Run a food bank, pick up the litter, save the planet, all worthwhile distractions from fighting over insoluble theological disagreements. But in fact, the task of interfaith relations, the task of living peacefully but not apathetically with difference, is fundamentally a parallel task to that of living in harmony with the non-human creation. Religious pluralism and ecology are a dual task of fashioning a common home for a fractured and fractious humanity, which lies at the heart of this centre's mission and responds to the most challenging crises of our time. So for 10 years, we have been engaging deeply with questions of religious difference and with the crisis of unsustainability. I don't know how well we're doing at the task Latour set us of being the antidote to the poison, but in our final short session this afternoon, you'll hear from some alumni of our Faith and Leadership programme who have been inspired by the climate change module to engage in different forms of climate action. It's not just a good cause, it's a calling for all of humanity to hear and respond to. And I'm delighted to see some activists in the room as well as academics, so I do hope you'll stay for that last short session on the intersection of research and climate action before joining us for a celebratory drink. Bruno Latour died on the 9th of October 2022. We pray that he may rest in peace and rise in glory. But he's with us in spirit and in word. Today's symposium is resourced and inspired by his posthumously published "If We Lose the Earth, We Lose Our Souls," as advertised here. In it, he talks of the need for a cosmological shift in Christianity that can finally overcome the destructive dualism that is in no small part responsible for our current predicament. We are delighted to welcome back Bishop Rowan Williams as our guest of honour today. This is our second 10th anniversary event, and some of you may have attended the conversation I had with Rory Stewart a couple of weeks ago. Unlike Rory, Bishop Rowan has not launched a hit podcast, though many of us wish that he would. Nor has he written a book about his falling out with the government, though I'm sure that book is in him too, and it would be magnificent. Instead, he continues to publish and tirelessly speak words of wisdom and truth that bring the diversity and depth of our Christian heritage to audiences in the academy, in the church, in the media, and across societies around the world. He was the 104th Archbishop of Canterbury, the Master of Magdalen College, Cambridge, a leading Christian voice of our age. Bishop Rowan, you honour us with your presence, and we look forward eagerly to what you have to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Jim. It's a real delight to be back here. And just looking at photographs from 10 years ago, I'm sort of faintly reassured that I'm not totally unrecognisable and decrepit after the last decade. Now, as you've heard, Bruno Latour's posthumously published book, "If We Lose the Earth, We Lose Our Souls," is part of the stimulus and provocation for this afternoon's conversation. So what I'd like to do in the next 40-45 minutes, so to leave some time for questions, is to speak a little bit about some of the themes that emerge in this book, to give you a sense of what he's talking about, to try to distill 4 main points which seem to me to come very much into focus as a result of the book, and perhaps to leave on the table some questions about what particularly religious faith and communities of religious faith have to put into the discussion. One of the most important points that Latour makes in this book is that the problem, and he would put it as bluntly as this, the problem is transcendence. The problem is that we have, as religious people, and particularly as Christian people, we have bought into what you might call an adversarial model of transcendence. Transcendence is what's not here. So if as people of faith we want to be aligned with or obedient to the transcendent, that apparently entails not paying very much attention to what's going on here. Now, we would all say from inside that that's a caricature of how religious faith is meant to work, and if we have any honesty or intelligence in the next moment or so, we'll say, actually though, when you put it like that, ... And so that problem of transcendence is weaving itself in and out of almost every page of this intriguing collection of late interventions in issues around faith and environmental ethics. And I'll come back to this in a moment. It also informs what Latour has to say about paganism. He says the mainstream religious traditions have really got paganism completely wrong. Back to that shortly. But now that focus on the problem that transcendence leaves us with, the idea that what really matters is elsewhere, Latour takes that in two different directions, equally, I think, significant and suggestive. One suggestion is about how you reframe the language of transcendence. When in the Christian New Testament, St. Paul says that our minds should be on things that are above, not on things that are below, what's the question he's actually trying to answer? Because, says Latour, obviously he doesn't simply mean think up rather than down. He doesn't even mean think transcendent rather than immediate, because that's not his vocabulary. What he seems to be most interested in, Latour argues, is the difference between what lasts and what passes. That particular injunction is the injunction to focus on what lasts rather than what comes and goes. And what lasts includes the world we're in, the environment through which we pass. That lasts in a way we don't last. And so to align ourselves with what lasts is one way of admitting that our own time of action, planning, anxiety, success and failure is not necessarily the center of the picture. So to be focused on what lasts rather than what passes, that, says Latour, is a very significant way, potentially, of translating the language of the transcendent and the immanent into something a little bit different and a little bit more immediately challenging for where we might be, both as activists and as people of faith. So let's park that for a moment. Second thing he's interested in here, and it's not, I think, wholly unconnected with that first point, is that in any intellectual and imaginative environment, the language of faith is always going to be shaped and inflected by the current narratives, the prevailing narratives in which people live. The story of salvation, as Christians in particular might put it, exists not in a vacuum, but in a particular kind of world. And in a way, what he's just said about what lasts and what passes and the language Paul uses about that, that illustrates the point. So really, how seriously, he asks, how seriously are we asking these days about the world which inflects our stories of salvation as that world changes rapidly and disturbingly? How much is our language of faith, and as I say, he's talking mostly about Christianity, but not exclusively, how much is our language of faith, in fact, now responding to, intelligently informed by, reacting creatively to the narratives of our culture? Unsurprisingly, his answer is, well, not very, really. And again, more of that shortly. But what interests me in that very particularly is that he connects that immediately to some of the work that he was doing in France in the last decade or so with grassroots discussion groups, discussion and action groups, where he was working with a whole range of people with different skills to animate and enable grassroots debate about the kind of world we were in, with a particular slant towards how that impacted on religious belief. And he talks about this, I think, very tellingly in terms of the enabling of a new kind of citizenship. The reconstruction of citizens who have common interests and who are capable of expressing them in front of authorities who themselves listen to what is being said requires a series of investigational arrangements that we're trying to build thanks to these workshops, these discussions that he has been involved in animating. But I would quite like you to keep in mind, as we unfold this conversation, that phrasing about the reconstruction of citizens who have common interests and who are capable of expressing them in front of authorities who themselves listen to what is being said. Because, in a nutshell, that's what you might call democracy. And that it takes a formulation like that to remind us that that might be what's called democracy is a bit of an index of how little we understand democracy these days, and how very little our democratic institutions invest in grassroots exploration, refinement of thinking, focusing of challenges, and enabling of confrontation, constructive confrontation with authority, let alone the fact that authorities who listen to what you're saying is not necessarily the first thing that would come to mind in quite a lot of political contexts these days. If I can open a bracket here very briefly, I've been involved for the last 2.5 years with the Independent Commission on the Constitutional Future of Wales. And one of the recommendations we came up with in the report, which was published back in January of this year, was that the Welsh Government should invest immediately and heavily in what we call democratic innovation. That is, capacity building for this kind of work, if we wanted to have an intelligent and critical democracy in Wales or anywhere else, frankly. Close brackets. So bear in mind that idea of reconstructed citizenship here. Another point that Latour draws out, which again has some relation to what I've just said, has to do with the way in which religious belief thinks about time and space. Now, once again, sorry to keep repeating this, he is focusing on a Christian history of discourse, and if you want to push the envelope a little bit, broadly speaking, the Abrahamic family of religions. One of the weaknesses of this discussion is an almost total lack of interest in non-Abrahamic religious practice and thinking, but that's another story. I'll stick with him for the moment and you can fill in the gaps yourself. But what he's saying about time and space is something like this. Broadly speaking, that Abrahamic family of religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, are very interested in time. They're very interested in the passage of time and change, in conversion, in moving towards an end in time. But at their most unconstructive, they seem to be very uninterested in space. And if you're interested in time at the expense of space, you're going to be rather more interested in what's going on inside your head than what your actual flesh and blood is in touch with. And at one point, there's a reference in the notes to the great 20th century Protestant theologian Paul Tillich, who said that the triumph of Christianity was the triumph of time over space. Don't quite know where to start with that one, but it illustrates the problem, I think, that Latour wants us to think about. And that, in turn, leads us to something of the desolate and disturbing position we're now in. Because as space recedes and time, in the sense of a focus on human narration, human memory, human ideas, human interaction, time privileged in that way, squeezing out space, ends up having no context, and so meaning nothing. It shrinks our humanity to that internal world, which is not simply independent of, but increasingly dismissive of or contemptuous of the world of space. Paganism, which is not very interested in time, is very interested in space. Holy things, holy places. And, says Latour, before we join Paul Tillich in celebrating the demise of space and the victory of time, we'd better think about that context in which our stories are told. And that takes us back, of course, to his interest in, his insistence on, a focus on where we are telling the story. So, what actually is different about the world we're in now that makes our religious storytelling tougher and more complicated? Well, the long and the short is that while we have in our various religious traditions had quite a bit to say about a promised end, a promised consummation at the end of time, we are suddenly confronted with a reality of ending, a sense of an ending. We are currently in a situation where the end could very well be upon us in terms of the sustainability of the Earth's ecology. And that sense of an end is, says Latour, both an index of how much we have let go in our distorted interest in time rather than space, and potentially a real open door into a reconceiving of human solidarity. Because, as he says at one point, our common interest at the moment is inseparable from the fact that we're all going to die. And not just die sometime, but die messily and unpleasantly and unfairly over a very disagreeable period as the Earth sort of melts around us. Now, something which I've found myself repeating all too often is that the great crises of our times are not geographically limited, or as it has been put, crises don't read maps. The ecological crisis, the epidemic crisis, and all sorts of other things don't carry passports. They just happen, and they happen to human beings as such. Can we, in some sense, mobilize that awareness of an impending end with creative intelligence? Well, maybe don't hold your breath, but that at least is how Latour wants to frame the question for us. And to relate it, of course, to that underlying issue of how we align ourselves with what lasts rather than with what passes, understanding what lasts in terms of that interlocking entirety in which we wholly exist. And so perhaps just one other point from these very rich, brief reflections. And that is something to do with the way in which Latour touches on and deploys in a variety of ways his own very distinctive philosophical agenda, which has to do, as you perhaps know, with a strong and persistent suspicion of a particular kind of Western rationalism. Here is the machinery that registers the data. Out there are the data, here is the processor. Data just sit there until we collect them. Then we process them, then we do things with them. And that's how the world works. And Latour, from his very earliest philosophical essays, has said, sometimes with quite controversial intensity, that is so absolutely not how it works that you don't know where to start with it. Dead stuff out there, live mind in here. That, he says, is where things begin to go wrong. And he got into a lot of trouble for saying that the sciences were not a matter of neutrally registering data helpfully flowing into the processor. The sciences were very sophisticated means of identifying the subset of stimuli that just might answer the question that you happen to be asking at that moment. You created the world you studied, in that sense. He wasn't in the least suggesting a kind of radical non-realism about the world, simply saying that the sciences work by asking very limited questions. They collect the data that answer those limited questions. They construct very credibly and sustainably a set of structures that will give you handhold to go on doing the same sort of thing. But beware of supposing that that is a matter of the all-powerful human intellect just scanning a lot of passive data and producing lots of results. It doesn't quite work like that. Well, I won't attempt to go into the detail of or the defense of Latour's overall understanding of knowledge and reality, but I think you'll see how it fits in a bit here. But it enables him, in some of these pieces, to make the very stark and startling observation that we better stop talking about nature with a capital N. What is the thing called nature that we are not? What is the thing called nature with a capital N that sits out there, which we can ideally control and manage, or which at worst gets the better of us, or which at the moment is in rather a bad way, so we better be nice to it? Forget nature with a capital N. Go back to the sense of being wholly inserted in a world of interaction. Be very careful even about using words like environment, just so that you remember that you are not the actors on the stage with a lot of painted scenery behind you. The environment, that which is around you rather than what you are part of. Just be careful, I think he's saying. The system of interdependence of which we are part is utterly our business because it's us. And I find that a useful kind of warning flag. I don't think that anytime soon we're going to have linguistic police wandering around slapping us on the wrists for saying nature or environment, but I think it's just a helpful thing to be brought up sharp with from time to time, to say, hang on, when I talk about the natural world, as opposed to me, and when I talk about the environment there as opposed to me here, be very careful about what you're importing into that discussion, because it can go seriously pear-shaped. And that's why at the end of the day, he says in a rather memorable little phrase that to prevent the end of time, to plunge into the realities here below, to immerse ourselves instead of emancipating ourselves, to learn to depend, such is the rediscovered movement and energy of apostolic preaching. Presented there as a religious imperative, but I think you can perhaps see it's not just a religious imperative. Immersion, not emancipation. And as he makes very clear in the last of the essays in this book, when he talks about immersion rather than emancipation, he's not talking at all about humanity adopting a wholly negative or passive position. He's not talking about human beings apologizing for their embarrassing impact on the rest of the finite world. He is talking about exercising our distinctively human gifts and capacities in a way that is responsible, that is answerable to and for where we are. No, he says in that last section, I'm not anti-technology. I'm not saying the imprint of humanity ought to be erased from creation. I'm not saying that we have a kind of corporate, inherited, original guilt just for being human in the world that we have so spectacularly screwed up. What's gone wrong is not that we're here as human, it's that we are still struggling to learn how to use our human intelligence cooperatively, participatorily, as part of something. And unless we can recover that, we're in a mess. But that doesn't mean that, again, I can't resist some of the quotes here. Yes, here we are. If we listen to the prophets of doom, we would have to feel guilty for our excesses. We would have to suspend our crazy innovations and feel our limits at last before returning in this way to a healthy sobriety. After the injunction to be fruitful and multiply, now they want to humiliate us with degrowth, stop growing, shrink, erase the trace you're leaving on this earth, shrink your footprint. Very few believers still observe the Lenten fast. Well, it is to long centuries of Lent that you were invited today. I'm not sure I wholly go along with some of the ways he expresses this, but I see the point. If all we have to say in the face of the crisis we share is stop, withdraw, be passive, we haven't actually taken responsibility for what has been done by us and in our name. We haven't actually taken responsibility for the skills and resources we, as a matter of fact, have for healing as well as destruction. How do we rethink technology, growth, whatever, in that context? And I think that possibly takes us back to the question about citizenship once again, and a critical and intelligent democracy. Just in the margin of that, I found myself just over a week ago in an online discussion with people at UCLA in California about faith flourishing in the environment, and was very struck by the way in which some of these issues were coming from a very, very different set of concerns in that intellectual world. Sharing a platform on that occasion with Judith Butler and with an African-American theologian who spoke again about matter, time, possession, and other related issues. And I was struck both in what Judith Butler had to say and in what Cameron had to say by the convergence with some of what Latour was coming up with. So just as a sort of note in the margin to say there are conversations like this going on very vigorously. Well, sorry, that's a rather scattergun summary of a few themes which come through very consistently in this little collection of Latour's. And I said I'd try to distill them into 4 clusters of ideas. And the first has to do with what I summed up as rethinking paganism. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have always been pretty unhappy about popular paganism. And in their different ways, whether it's good King Josiah in Hebrew scripture, whether it's Anglo-Saxon missionaries cutting down sacred oaks in Germany in the 8th century, or whether it's the Islamic anxiety about idols, originally in the time of the Prophet in Makkah, but also more recently. In all these ways, the Abrahamic religions have been very, very jumpy about paganism because it's immediately associated with idolatry. You find yourself worshipping stuff you've made, and that's not good for you. Well, fine, says Latour. That was the question they had to answer. There was an issue about idolatry. There always is, because of the human compulsion to worship stuff we've made and to fixate on what passes rather than what lasts, to go back to that phrase. But what about all those other aspects of paganism, in inverted commas, which are not quite so easily reduced? The sense of presence or welcome or interaction with the space you're in, the sense of the holy, the sacred, in the material. Do we not have to recover a little bit of paganism and perhaps even apologize a bit for being quite so absolutist and quite so annihilating about all that it represents? what would happen if we rethought paganism? What would happen if, in fact, we turned the whole thing right upside down and said the paradox is that paganism is very much about what we don't control or own, its presences and powers around us. So far from it just being idolatry, projecting out onto the world what's inside us, maybe we learn something from understanding our dependence, our helplessness in certain respects in the face of a world we do not own and do not manage. What about rethinking paganism on those lines? And I'm not at all sure what to make of that as a proposal, but I put it there as one of the things which Latour really constructively and provocatively leaves on the table. Second thing is this interest in reminding us all that we live in a time of endings, that we have the sense of an ending pressing upon us. And here he picks up, very interestingly, a phrase from the Greek text of the Christian scriptures, from one of St. Paul's letters to the Thessalonians, where St. Paul uses the strange word katechon at one point. Katechon meaning something that holds back or restrains. And, says Latour, what if the task of people of faith at the moment is to be a katechon, a restrainer of what seems to be an irresistible drive towards the end? But whatever we make of that, to recognize that living with the sense of a time of endings is potentially something which unites, which allows us to talk to one another as human beings, at perhaps a deeper and more serious level than we'd expected. The third thing is the point I was just talking about, the idea that we need to let go of a particular way of thinking of nature. And it goes with, he says, all sorts of idioms like natural laws or the processes of nature. Yes, it's all very well. They're all very helpful handholds for certain kinds of tasks. But they all subtly pressurize us towards that idea of nature as the stuff out there, as opposed to the mind in here. So, in responding to where we are, the critical times in which we live, part of that response needs to be a skepticism about nature, as used in that sense. And then the fourth point is how very deeply Latour sees all this as bound up with a recovery of intelligent politics. Intelligent politics. As you may have noticed, this, an overabundance of intelligent politics is not one of the problems we face globally just at the moment. But the restoration, the renaissance of an intelligent politics has something to do with allowing people to understand both their vulnerability and their responsibility. Vulnerability is something which they share with people they've never met, but whose fate is locked in with theirs. Responsibility, therefore, with and for them. Accountability for a situation that affects everyone. And that begins with assisting and accompanying and supporting people in identifying the challenges they face at the local level and the power they have and they don't have or ought to have. Much more could be said about that, but I very much welcome that particular association, that to be interested in and passionate about and concerned for the ecological crisis is not an alternative to working for a renewal of proper intelligent politics. On the contrary, you cannot do the one without the other. In other words, you can't create or sustain a kind of democratically satisfying politics if what you're doing is teaching people to ignore the situation they're actually in. Any politics that is teaching you to ignore things is bad politics and corrupt politics. No, axiomatic, I think. So don't think of these as alternatives. So, just winding down before we have some conversation. All of this, I think, takes very much for granted a picture of faith, any faith, as fundamentally a habit of orientation in the world. A habit of orientation. Not first and foremost a set of propositions, not even first and foremost a set of strictly codified principles for behavior, but a habit of orientation, a way of being in relation to the world we're in, and being in relation to the world's maker in and through the ways we are in relation to the world we're in. So, part of the challenge that Latour and others, I think, would be leaving us with has to do with how we really imagine faith. And speaking in this Californian symposium a couple of weeks ago, I was interested by the fact that that became one of the burdens of the conversation. How exactly, when we say faith flourishing in the environment, when we use the word faith, when we talk about a faith centre even, what actually are we talking about where faith is concerned? Are we talking simply about a convenient shorthand for a socially identifiable group that has certain peculiar habits and certain peculiar ideas? Or are we talking about forms of orientation in the world, habits of orientation? And alongside that, I think it's very important to bear in mind that our traditions of faith, all of them in their different ways, when they're doing their job, are challenging certain kinds of paradigms of knowledge, challenging the data plus processor model of knowing, reminding us that talking about our knowledge has a great deal more to do than we think with material habit and physical habit. And maybe the last thing emerging from that, Latour, as I said right at the start, questions the idea of transcendence and invites us to rethink it. And I think that what he is in effect suggesting is that we have to rethink transcendence as a kind of dispossession. I haven't completely thought this one through, but that's what occurred to me as I came to the end of reading this book. Transcendence as dispossession. That is, the transcendent is what impacts upon us or comes alive in us when we have learned a certain kind of letting go, a certain kind of non-possessiveness about the world we're in. And is that something which the language of our faith traditions can contribute in the formation of a new paradigm of our relation with a world moving, so we fear, towards an end of some sort? If we lose the earth, we lose our souls. Latour neatly inverts the familiar text from Christian scripture, what does it profit you if you gain the whole world and lose your soul? And Latour says, well, what does it profit you if you lose the world and gain your soul? Because the gaining of your soul, that is the formation of a relational, responsible presence, interacting with others and interacting with what is ultimately true, that gaining of the soul cannot happen if we lose the world, if we lose the sense of an environment in which that is materially enacted. And our problem, as he says more than once, is not that we live in a materialistic age, that we live in a radically anti-material culture where increasingly what matters is not stuff, the living reality of our bodies and other bodies, but an extraordinarily thinned down picture of information whose exchange is the only thing that matters in our presence in the world. What have we done with ourselves that we think the exchange of information is the same as life? If we could possibly get back to thinking what life might mean in matter and finitude and vulnerability, maybe we could gain our souls, paradoxically, by regaining our bodies as part of this interactive system that is our Earth. Thank you very much for listening patiently. I'd love to hear what you think.